They thought she was just another pretty face, someone who'd be out of place at their expensive dinner table. But they had no idea she'd just graduated as the top law student in the entire state. Tonight, their cruel whispers would turn into stunned silence. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Simply Stories for more powerful tales like this. She arrived just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of deep orange and violet. The air was cool, the faint scent of blooming jasmine drifting through the driveway as her heels clicked softly against the polished stone path. She had chosen a sleek black dress, simple yet elegant, its fabric catching the last traces of daylight. As she walked toward the towering front doors of the mansion, the house loomed before her, an architectural masterpiece of glass, wood, and marble, its tall windows glowing warmly from the lights inside. But the closer she came, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as though the home itself carried a guarded kind of pride. She paused for just a second at the doorstep, adjusting her posture, smoothing the lines of her dress, and inhaling deeply before pressing the doorbell. When the doors swung open, the first thing that greeted her was a wave of polished hospitality. Smile here, a nod there, but beneath it all was something she couldn't quite ignore. The way their eyes moved over her was calculated, lingering too long, measuring every detail of her appearance as though taking inventory. Their smiles, though warm on the surface, didn't quite reach their eyes. One voice welcomed her in, its tone dripping with practiced charm, but the edges of the words were sharp enough to slice. She stepped inside, the click of her heels echoing faintly against the glossy marble floor. The air inside was scented with roasted herbs and butter, the aroma of an elaborate dinner meant to impress. Yet even that warmth couldn't erase the underlying chill in the room. They led her toward the dining room, a grand space dominated by a long mahogany table that stretched almost the length of the room. Overhead, a chandelier of glistening crystals cast golden light across silver cutlery. In crystal glasses, each piece arranged with mathematical precision. The centerpiece was a lavish spread of fresh flowers, their fragrance mingling with the scent of the food. Every seat was already taken except for the one at the far end, a chair subtly set apart like a quiet reminder that she was not part of this circle. She took her place with grace, her movements measured, her expression unreadable. The opening conversations were easy enough. Light talk about the weather, the latest art gallery opening, and the quality of the wine they were drinking. But even in these harmless exchanges, she could feel it, that subtle edge to their tone. A way of speaking that seemed harmless at first glance, but carried an undercurrent of judgment. The questions began as small talk, but they had a precision. To them, each one carefully chosen to reveal something or to box her into a narrative they had already decided upon. They didn't ask about her work, her achievements, or her education. Instead, they leaned toward the trivial, her hobbies, her favorite vacation spots, whether she liked shopping in the city. Every question was delivered with the same polite smile, but the message was clear. They were not truly interested in knowing her, only in confirming the picture they already had in their minds. She answered with a calm, poised voice, giving nothing away. When one asked if she enjoyed cooking, her smile was faint but unwavering as she replied with just enough detail to be polite. When another commented, "I imagine you're more into fun than hard work," she simply let the statement float in, the air without challenging it, her gaze holding theirs long enough to make them look away. Around her, forks clinked gently against plates, glasses chimed softly, and muted laughter drifted from one end of the table to the other. But here and there, she caught glimpses of something else. Sideways glances exchanged between two relatives, one leaning in to whisper into the other's ear before both cast a quick look in her direction. A smirk here, a raised eyebrow there. Each gesture so quick that anyone not paying attention might have missed it. Still, she didn't let her composure slip. Her back was straight, her chin level, her smile quiet but steady. She engaged when necessary, nodded where appropriate, and let their words roll past her without showing the slightest crack in her expression. If they expected her to falter under their gaze, they would be disappointed. She knew the weight of silent judgment had followed her through lecture halls, through courtrooms, through the very moments that had defined her success. And she knew better than to waste her energy fighting it too soon. The food was exquisite, each course arriving on fine porcelain plates carried by discreet staff who moved like shadows. Conversation flowed easily among them, stories of vacations in Europe, business ventures, and the accomplishments of their own children. It's always told with a certain flourish that suggested no one else could quite measure up. Occasionally, one would throw her a question so casually phrased it might have seemed innocent to anyone else, but she recognized the testing in their tone. "So, what do you do in your spare time? Do you enjoy parties? Ever been to Monaco?" None of these questions touched on anything that truly mattered about her. It was as though they had drawn a line in the air, keeping her on one side of it. She let her gaze travel the length of the table, taking in every face, every expression. The lighting caught the gleam of crystal glasses, the soft gold of candle. Flames flickering between courses, she could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere beyond the dining room. Steady rhythm, a reminder that this evening was only just beginning. Beneath the small talk, she could sense an expectation building, not that she would impress them, but that she would confirm their assumptions, that she would say something to prove she was out of place here. And yet, she had no intention of giving them that satisfaction. She knew the power of silence, the strength of letting others reveal themselves before you spoke. For now, she would play their game, offering them nothing they could use against her. She listened as they spoke of their traditions, their long-standing family values, the circles they moved in. She noticed how often their glances drifted toward her when they thought she wasn't looking, and how quickly they looked away when her eyes met theirs. As the first hour passed, the tension beneath the politeness became almost tangible. It was in the way someone's smile lingered just a little too long, in the pauses that came after certain remarks, in the subtle tightness at the corners of their mouths. The meal might have been warm, the room might have been filled with golden light, but the air between them remained cool. She could feel it pressing against her, testing her. And yet, she sat in that chair like she belonged there because she knew she did. Tonight, she wasn't here to defend herself or to prove herself worthy in their eyes. Tonight, she was here to listen, to watch, and to wait. Because sooner or later, the moment would come when their assumptions would shatter, and she intended to be ready when it did. The conversation shifted slowly, like a tide drawing farther from the shore, and with it came a subtle change in tone. The politeness of earlier was still present, but it now carried an unmistakable sharpness, a quiet challenge woven into every word. Someone at the far end of the table leaned back in their chair, swirling the deep red wine in their glass before remarking that their family had always valued tradition. The words were smooth, almost casual, but the way they lingered in the air made their intent clear. It was not a celebration of heritage, was a line drawn in the sand, a gentle, but a deliberate reminder that she was not part of their long, carefully guarded history. Her gaze remained steady, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles, but she caught the flicker of satisfaction in the speaker's eyes, as though they believed they'd successfully put her in her place. Before she could even respond, another voice joined in, this one with a laugh that carried just a hint of condescension. They mused aloud about how law school must be easier these days, adding that the standards couldn't possibly be what they once were. The comment was phrased as a light-hearted joke, but its blade was sharp. A few others chuckled in agreement, nodding as if this were an indisputable truth. She kept her expression calm, offering no reaction, even as a spark of heat flickered. Deep in her chest, she had heard such words before, in classrooms, in offices, in moments where her achievements were weighed against invisible scales and found wanting, not because of their merit, but because of who she was. The conversation flowed on, but the edges grew sharper with each turn. Their questions now came laced with subtle mockery, a game of pushing boundaries to see if she would crack. When one mentioned a cousin's business struggles, another quipped that some people just aren't cut out for the real world there. Glance sliding toward her for just a second too long. She caught it, filed it away, and remained silent. To them, her silence might have looked like uncertainty, but it was a choice and act of control. Midway through the main course, a younger member of the family brought up a legal case that had dominated the news for weeks. Their voice was animated, but as they spoke, it became clear they were deliberately oversimplifying the matter, twisting the details into something cartoonish. When they finished their retelling, they turned to her with a smile that was anything but friendly. "You know about this, right?" The question hung in the air, dripping with expectation. It was a trap, carefully baited, designed to corner her into either stumbling over the details or admitting ignorance. She took a sip of water before answering, her voice calm, her words precise. In just a few sentences, she dismantled their oversimplified version, replacing it with the correct facts. She explained the legal principles at play, the procedural nuances that had shaped the case, and even mentioned a precedent from years earlier that had guided the court's decision. There was no arrogance in her tone, only clarity, every word chosen with care. For a moment, the table was quiet, as though they were processing what she had just said. But instead of acknowledging her insight, the cousin gave a tight smile, nodded once, and turned to speak to someone else, swiftly changing the topic to an upcoming vacation. The dismissal was blatant, and it spread to the others like a silent cue. In seconds, it was as though her words had never been spoken at all. She didn't react, but beneath the table, her fingers curled slightly, pressing against her palm. Then came the moment that cut deeper than the rest. The family elder, a man whose presence seemed to command the table, leaned forward with a chuckle that was both patronizing and dismissive. "Book smarts don't mean much in the real world," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a final verdict. 8. The statement was met with a round of laughter from several others, the sound light but tinged with approval, as though they had all been waiting for someone to say it. The words struck like a deliberate challenge. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she kept her eyes on the elder, studying him as though she were reading a witness in court. The laughter around the table swelled, filling the space with the easy confidence of people certain they had the upper hand. Her hands, resting in her lap, tightened until her nails pressed gently against her skin. Not enough to leave a mark, but enough to remind her she was still in control. She let the noise wash over her, her gaze drifting to the flicker of candlelight. In the crystal glasses, the way the flames bent and swayed with every movement in the room, it was a small, grounding detail, something she could focus on while the air around her grew thicker with their mockery. Every instinct in her told her to strike back, to dismantle each insult with the precision she had spent years honing. But she knew it was not yet time. There was more to learn here, more to see in the way they interacted. In the alliances and glances exchanged like hidden signals across the table, the elder leaned back, clearly pleased with himself, his hand resting lazily on the polished armrest of his chair. Around him, the others resumed their conversations, but the undertone had shifted. They had tested her, prodded at her, and in their minds, they had found her wanting. They couldn't know that the stillness they mistook for weakness was, in truth, the steady coiling of a spring. She sipped her wine slowly, letting its warmth spread through her as she catalogued every word, every smirk, every raised eyebrow. The night was far from over, and she was already shaping her next move. For now, she would let them believe their laughter had weight. Soon enough, that laughter would falter, and the silence that followed would belong entirely to her. The clinking of forks against desert plates filled the brief lull in conversation, the rich aroma of coffee drifting across the table as the servers placed delicate slices of layered cake in front of each guest. The mood seemed lighter for a moment, the earlier jabs fading into the background as they indulged in the sweetness. But it didn't take long before the conversation shifted again, this time into more serious territory. A complaint rose from one end of the table, the speaker's tone dripping with frustration as they recounted a recent legal battle involving the family's business. The words were vague, deliberately broad, as though they were more interested in venting than explaining the actual details. Another voice joined in, agreeing that their current lawyers were utterly incompetent and had no idea what they were doing. The accusation hanging heavily in the air, as the discussion deepened, they tossed around fragments of the dispute, mentions of contracts, delays, missed filings, but never in a complete or coherent way. It was like listening to a puzzle being described by people who only held a handful of the pieces. She sat quietly, her spoon resting beside her untouched dessert, her attention fully on the conversation. Every detail they dropped, every frustrated sigh, every bitter aside, she filed away in perfect order in her mind. Years of legal training had taught her to hear not just what was said, but what was left unsaid, and in those omissions. She could already see the shape of the real problem. Forming, then came the comment. One of them, a younger relative with a sly smile, turned toward her and leaned back in their chair, as though preparing to be entertained. "I'm sure this is all way over your head, dear." The words were light, almost playful on the surface, but they were barbed, meant to reinforce the same narrative they'd been pushing all evening, that she was out of place, in over her head and not worth taking seriously. A few others smirked, their eyes glancing toward her to see if she would blush, stammer, or retreat into silence. Instead, she straightened slightly in her seat, her gaze sweeping across the table in a slow, deliberate arc before settling back on the one who had spoken. Her voice, when it came, was calm and even, carrying no hint of the sting she might have felt. She began simply confirming that she had followed everything they'd been discussing, and then, without pause, she eased into the heart of the matter. She started by clarifying the central issues, summarizing her dispute in a way so precise and accurate that a few of them exchanged quick, startled glances. Then she began to unpack the layers they had only brushed against. She spoke of the contract, clauses they'd likely overlooked, clauses that could change the entire direction of the case. She pointed out procedural missteps their current lawyers had made, explaining how those errors could have been avoided and how they might still be corrected. Her tone remained steady, never hurried, each word chosen with care. She wove in references, two past cases with similar circumstances, citing the years, the jurisdictions, even the names of the presiding judges, all from memory. The names of the cases weren't just thrown into the conversation as a show of knowledge. She explained why those precedents mattered, how they could be used strategically, and what their opponents might do in response. It was not the voice of someone trying to impress, it was the voice of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The transformation in the room was almost physical. Where moments earlier there had been laughter and dismissive glances, there was now stillness. Forks paused mid-air, cups hovered just above saucers, and every eye was fixed on her. Even those who had been half distracted by their desserts were now leaning forward slightly, drawn into her explanation, despite themselves. The smirks faded, replaced by expressions of quiet concentration. She continued, breaking down the potential court strategies into simple, logical steps that even the least legally minded person at the table could follow. I outlined the risks, the advantages, the probable timelines, and the kind of settlement they could realistically aim for. The conversation no longer belonged to them, belonged to her. Every word shaping the room in ways they hadn't anticipated. And then it happened. The elder, the same one who had scoffed at book smarts earlier in the evening, cleared his throat. The shift in his tone was unmistakable. There was no sarcasm, no trace of mockery, only genuine curiosity. He asked her a question direct, relevant, and carefully phrased as if he were seeking her professional opinion rather than testing her. She met his gaze evenly, answering with the same measured confidence she had displayed from the start. Her response was thorough but concise, addressing his concern while offering a solution they had clearly never considered. The elder nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, and for the first time that evening, there was no laughter to follow. Her words. The room had changed, and everyone in it knew it. The change was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the shift in air before a storm passes. But as she finished speaking, it became undeniable. The once narrowed eyes now held her gaze without mockery, the corners of their mouths no longer curling into smirks. They were looking at her differently, not through the lens of prejudgment or idle amusement, but with a focused attention that only comes when someone realizes they've underestimated the person in front of them. It wasn't a sudden warmth. These were people who didn't surrender their pride easily, but it was respect. the kind that slips in quietly when arrogance is forced to step aside. One relative, the same who had tossed casual jabs earlier, cleared their throat and leaned in slightly, their voice lowered just enough to feel like a confession. They admitted they hadn't realized she had graduated as valedictorian of her law class, that she had been the top among thousands of students. The words were laced with a faint awkwardness, the kind that comes when someone knows they've been wrong and isn't quite sure how to make it right. She simply nodded in acknowledgement, her expression calm, offering no trace of triumph or need for validation. Across the table, another tried to disguise their discomfort with a smile, claiming their earlier remarks had been just teasing, their tone light, but their eyes betraying something heavier. It was the language of retreat, the quiet rewriting of an earlier offense into something harmless in the hope of easing the sting. But the regret was there, unspoken yet unmistakable, settling into the silence that followed. She didn't challenge it or demand an apology. She let it stand as it was, a truth they would carry long after tonight. Her face remained composed, serene, the faintest softness in her eyes, not from pity, but from an unshakable understanding that this was always how the evening would end. There was no need to gloat, no desire to revel in their reversal. She had known from the first moment she stepped through the door that they would try to measure her against their standards. What they had failed to realize was that her worth was never in question, not to her, and certainly not defined by them. As the conversation picked back up, it no longer revolved around her supposed shortcomings or her place at the table. Instead, it shifted naturally toward her insight. One after another, they began to bring up matters that had clearly been weighing on them for months: disputes over contracts, questions about investments, even personal legal concerns they had hesitated to share before. Their tones were markedly different now, polite but attentive, seeking her perspective not as a novelty, but as someone whose opinion carried weight. She answered each question with the same composed clarity she had shown earlier, offering practical advice without overstating her role. There was no need to embellish. Facts delivered with quiet confidence spoke for themselves. Some took notes discreetly on their phones, others nodded in thoughtful silence. The shift was complete. She was no longer an outsider under examination, but a voice they wanted in the room. By the time the evening began to wind down, the energy at the table was entirely different from when she had first sat down. Where there had been calculated politeness, there was now a more genuine ease. Laughter returned, but it was no longer tinged with condescension. When the plates were cleared and the final cups of coffee were poured, they lingered in conversation rather than rushing to end the night. As she stood to leave, the difference in their farewells was impossible to miss. The same hands that had earlier offered her a light, perfunctory greeting now reached out in firm, deliberate handshakes. Nods were deeper, eye contact held longer, and there was an unspoken acknowledgement in each exchange, understanding that the balance between them had shifted. Even the elder, whose words had cut the sharpest earlier in the night, offered her a respectful nod, his expression unreadable, but his gesture enough to speak volumes. Stepping out into the cool night air, she felt none of the tension she had carried walking in. The breeze was gentle, the hum of distant traffic a quiet backdrop to her thoughts. As the car pulled away from the house, she sat back, letting the streetlights wash over her in fleeting patterns. The evening replayed itself in her mind, each comment, each glance, each moment of underestimation now neatly placed into perspective. She didn't feel anger toward them, if anything. There was a certain clarity in seeing how quickly ignorance could unravel in the presence of truth. People often clung to their assumptions because it was easier than confronting the discomfort of being wrong. But knowledge didn't need to shout to be heard. It didn't need to fight for space in the room. It simply existed, steady and undeniable, until those who doubted it had no choice but to listen. The car moved steadily through the quiet streets, the rhythm of the road a calm counterpoint to the earlier tension. She glanced out the window at the darkened buildings, the city lights flickering in the distance, and let a small, private smile form. It wasn't a smile of victory, it was the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had carried herself with grace, that she had let her work and her words speak for her. Ignorance could be loud. It could fill a room with laughter and sharp comments. with the false confidence of those certain they understood the world. But knowledge, true, unshakable knowledge, had its own kind of power. It could silence a room without raising its voice. Tonight, she had reminded them of that truth in the simplest way possible, by being exactly who she was, without bending to their expectations. When the car turned onto her street, the night felt lighter somehow, the weight of the evening left behind in that grand dining room. Tomorrow, they would return to their lives, perhaps never speaking of the discomfort they had felt in their own dining chairs. But the shift had happened, and it would linger in the back of their minds. For her, that was more than enough.